Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is Benjamin Franklin, a young Benjamin Franklin. And to help us learn about it, we are going to interview Stephen Coss, author of the book Fever of 1721 today. Now, the Fever of 1721 is mostly about the smallpox epidemic that ravaged Boston in 1721 and the inoculation trials that happened there. It's the first time in North America, if not in Western history, that inoculations were tried. And we discuss today how that affected the life of a young Benjamin Franklin and then an old Benjamin Franklin. So I really hope you enjoy this discussion. Thank you for joining us. In your book, you discuss the smallpox epidemic that broke out in the early 1720s in Boston. And today we wanted to focus on Benjamin Franklin. Could you tell us a little bit about what Benjamin Franklin was up to a half century before the American Revolution?
Yeah, sure. First of all, Jason, thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here. A lot of people, I'm sure most of your viewers will know Ben Franklin is not from Philadelphia, but from Boston. However, a lot of people don't even realize that he had some very formative years in his life before he got to Philadelphia. And in my book, The Fever of 1721, I write about Ben Franklin at basically from age 12 through age 17. And he was in Boston. He was working as a printer's apprentice for his older brother, James Franklin. And Ben was sort of had a ringside seat for the main event of my book, which is the smallpox epidemic that happened that year, and the first inoculation trial in Western medicine, which also happened. And Ben and his brother James used that to start a newspaper. So Ben Franklin, the publisher, who now, when he gets to Philadelphia, he becomes this extremely successful publisher, able to retire in his 40s. But he learned a lot of what he learned not only about printing, but about publishing, about medicine, about science, about being political, about being diplomatic. A lot of things came out of this period of his life, which most people don't know much about.
So speaking on that, based on his relationship to the epidemic, do you think it had a large effect on his career? It sounds like you're saying it had a large effect on his career. Not just as a publisher, but later not as a physician, but as a doctor of sorts.
Yeah. Well, Ben Franklin became, in the strictest sense, it did, in the sense that Franklin became a friend of many doctors, very interested in medicine himself, had a few inventions that were related to medicine, and also became the foremost advocate and proponent of inoculation in the colonies. Philadelphia became the inoculation center pre-American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson was one of the people who came to Philadelphia to be inoculated against smallpox. So a lot of Franklin's interest in medicine and interest specifically in smallpox inoculation obviously came from his experience with the first inoculation experiment. In a greater sense, I think, there was a doctor named Boylston who conducted this experiment. And Boylston, like Ben Franklin, came from very humble beginnings. He didn't have money. He didn't have a position of prominence. His family didn't, I should say. And Franklin, as a 16-year-old young man, got to see Boylston, someone who had the same kind of disadvantages that he had, succeed and become celebrated and become a member of the Royal Society, which was the foremost scientific organization in the world at that point. So, it was a great inspiration to a young kid like Ben Franklin, who was like, yeah, maybe I can rise above my circumstances.
And the experiments with Boylston you're referring to, those are the first inoculation trials ever, essentially.
Correct. Yeah, certainly in Western medicine, as it came to pass that, the inoculation as a procedure had been practiced for many, many years, many decades, maybe even centuries, elsewhere in the world, in China and in Africa. And the way inoculation got to the colonies and got to Boston was in part through an African slave who was a slave of the minister Cotton Mather, and who had been inoculated as a young boy before he was kidnapped to America, and who told Mather about this unique scar on his arm. So it was, we shouldn't claim that inoculation started in Boston. By no means is that true. The importance of that experiment was that it was the first kind of empirical test of inoculation. Boylston kept records of the 280 some odd people he inoculated. So we had some kind of a record to see about the efficacy and also about the safety, how many died, how many lived. And the success of that experiment then helped Western medicine embrace the process, which led to vaccination, which is an improved form of inoculation around the turn of the century. And vaccination in the more generic sense, of course, led to all the diseases that we don't have because of that procedure.
That's fascinating. As for Franklin in particular, do we know if he was ever inoculated?
I don't, but I wish I did. I actually spent a lot of time trying to track that down because he was in Boston at the time of the smallpox epidemic when only, I mean, by some estimates, only a few hundred people escaped being sickened by smallpox, being infected by smallpox. Now, there were many who were immune because of a previous epidemic, so they'd had that immunity from having survived it. But of the people who had not had it before and become immune, which included Ben Franklin, only a few hundred didn't get it. And Ben Franklin seems to have been one of them. Ben Franklin then went on to, obviously travel the world widely. And so he was exposed to smallpox, one would think, on any number of occasions, or nearly exposed. He had a son who died from smallpox. So presumably at some point, in the son's sickness, he was close to him, one would hope. And but we don't know that he got it, and we don't know that he was inoculated. And what's odd about that for me is that, as I said, he became one of the foremost proponents of inoculation. So you think one of the great arguments for it was, I had smallpox and nearly died. I'm glad I got it. I'm glad other people can be inoculated, which is actually what George Washington said. Washington had naturally occurring smallpox and also became an advocate for inoculation. And part of it was his personal experience. So you think either Franklin would do that, or he would say, I was inoculated and it worked for me. So I'm not only an advocate of this, I'm a participant in it. And yet I have not been able to find any mention about his own personal experience. He writes about his son's experience. He writes about it more generically a lot, but he doesn't write about his own experience. And in all the biographies I'm aware of Franklin, it has not been addressed.
That's interesting, and further interesting because he's someone who wrote so much throughout his life. You're right. You would think he would leave us some kind of mark.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
No, I'm saying, yeah, he absolutely would. You would think so. He wasn't a retiring type when it came to, if I've got a good argument, I'm going to make it.
Right, exactly. And, you think that kind of event would even make it into his autobiography, although there seems to be a good amount missing from that. But
yeah, everything embarrassing is missing from that.
Yeah, exactly. As for Franklin, though, do you think, or do you happen to know if the smallpox epidemic had any effect on his decision to leave? I know famously he didn't have the best relationship with his older brother, but I wonder if the smallpox and the whole situation kind of convinced him to try out, New York and then Philly?
Right, yeah, that's what he did. I think indirectly it did. What happened was, as I think I mentioned, he and James started a newspaper, and they used the controversy over inoculation to sort of jumpstart the newspaper. The newspaper was actually against inoculation, which would be surprising to a lot of people. And Franklin did go on to become the foremost proponent of inoculation. But I think for business reasons, because the majority of the people in town were against inoculation, he thought, if I'm going to start a paper, I'm going to appeal to the largest audience, and that was anti-inoculation. And that paper then went on to, it created controversy in that sense. A lot of people did not like the Franklins. The people on the other side, Cotton Mather, being a very powerful minister, was one of them. But then the paper went on from its opposition to inoculation to also be really outrageous. I mean, it really was, satirically, it was a lot like what we see today with like The Daily Show or Colbert or, Trevor Noah, people like that. So it had that aspect to it. And it also took on the government in a very direct way, which newspapers in America had never done. Newspapers, period, had never done. The newspaper was still a relatively new thing in 1721. So anyway, long story short is by the time all this transpired, the Franklins were persona non grata in Boston. And I think Ben realized that his brother didn't have a future there, and he probably didn't have a future there. And so he left.
Very interesting. And went on to do some pretty good things.
Pretty good things. I'd say he did okay, yeah.
Yeah, he made it. He did. He made it. Thank you so much. I like to end every interview like this by asking, are there any other founding parents of the United States that you think deserve to get a little bit more credit, either in the public at large or even just in American history circles?
Yeah, somebody that I've studied a little bit now, because I've doing a lot of work on the Stamp Act, which I think is a very important, obviously precursor to the Revolution. And Christopher Gadsden, is known for the Gadsden Flag, and we know, that's all around us today, being used in ways that I'm not sure he would approve of, but it's certainly front and center in our current political debate. I think a lot of people owe it to him and to their interest in the flag to get to know more about Christopher Gadsden. And he was, South Carolinian. He was a really fascinating person. He, a very fiery person. He's known as the Sam Adams of the South. And he, one of the quotes that I love is he at one point said, there should be no New Englanders, no New Yorkers, but all of us Americans, or all of them Americans. I'm not sure about the quote exactly, but this is pre-Constitution. This is really a call for unity that I think was not very common at that point. It was more common to be against England than it was to be interested in sort of a true unity of the colonies. So anyway, I nominate Christopher Gadsden. He's not a signer, but he did participate in both of the Continental Congresses, and certainly was a formative presence in having the war happen. And he fought in the war, and he was captured. He was a prisoner. So yeah, he's an interesting guy.
Yeah, for sure. Well, he did sign the Stamp Act, the letters to the king. So
True.
That's close enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. You are full of amazing information, and I can't tell you how much we appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I sure hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Make sure you check out Stephen's book, Fever of 1721. I put a link in the description below for your convenience, and it's available wherever fine books are sold. Make sure you hit like and subscribe so you can come back for another founder tomorrow and another interview next Thursday with Michael Troy of the AM Rev podcast.